Today, we are delighted to speak with Alexander Ott, the co-founder of Aegis Consent. He has been at the forefront of developing systems that address sexual misconduct with empathy and precision. He's also the director of communications at PASS, People Advocating Sexual Safety, where he leads national conversations around consent culture, education, and legislative advocacy. His work is shaping the future of how we understand accountability, empowerment, and prevention. Good morning, Alex. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Good morning, Ashley. Thank you so much for having me.
This is an honor, and I have been so looking forward to being able to talk to you and to have this conversation and really to be able to pick your mind and to hear all of the opportunities that we have as a community to be able to support the work that you're doing that is so incredibly important. So let's start with the beginning. Let's talk about education and consent. So why is consent education so vital?
Well, the real root of the issue is setting a foundation for children. It doesn't always have to be sexual in nature, but getting young people kind of in tune with this concept of free agency. You know, if it makes them uncomfortable, speak out against it, kind of remove yourself from the situation, get an adult that you feel is responsible. When it comes to consent, it doesn't always have to be sexual. We can start the conversation at something as simple as, are you comfortable with wearing like a blue shirt today? Are you comfortable with wearing a yellow shirt?
It's really beginning to teach agency at a young age, which I think is really important.
Exactly.
Because when you start to have harder conversations, if you haven't built that foundation, there's really nothing to go on, is there?
Yes, and what we're really trying to hammer down is training that resiliency. You know, making sure that a young child would have the strength of will and fortitude to say, no, this isn't right, I don't like this, stop.
And I think what we're seeing is that consent education is incredibly limited in the schools, that this is something that really does need to begin at home. But why are the school systems so behind in practicing this incredibly important skill with our students and children?
Thank you for a wonderful question, by the way. I'll try to answer that in a couple different parts. Firstly, there's only 20 states, including the District of Columbia, that actually teach consent as part of their sex ed curriculum. And as a part of that consent education, it's widely known that the greatest component of that is abstinence. So all they're really preaching is don't have sex, and you will never have sexual assault. So we really try to skirt around what is the traditional abstinence above all and teach them that sex is a very normal part of human behavior. And more so now than ever. And we want to encourage healthy interpersonal relationships rather than spurn them. So part one is educating on the fact that sex happens and what consent is in the context of sex. What we can do to try to shift the narrative from abstinence to a more consent-centered conversation is to express that we have nearly 500,000 reported sexual assaults in the United States every single year. That is similar to the number of influenza cases we have each year. And we all know the campaigns, the vaccines, the mandates before anyone can go to college. So it's strange to me and many other advocates in the space that with such a widespread issue, we aren't seeing as much coverage on the lacking prevention systems and the education that could go into kind of stopping an injurious experience like that. So beyond just consent conversations, sexual assault is beyond just consent conversations, sexual education is severely lacking. 51% of Americans actually receive some kind of sex ed in high school, and the other 49% report having never attended or having never been taught it while attending a public school.
That is incredibly limited. So basically half of the population has not received any type of conversation about sexual education in the schools.
Pretty much. And we're seeing that it's not that different in the house. Many students have parents that feel kind of awkward or maybe believe that it would be the school's responsibility to teach these topics to their kids. And it's one of those situations where I thought you handled it, oh, I thought you handled it. And as comedic as that may sound, we end up with young men and women that go to college and are thrust into independence without being properly prepared.
And so are we seeing a call to remedy that, especially in lower elementary, right? Going into middle school, really that's a time when I think these conversations just start beginning.
Absolutely.
Going into high school, is there a campaign of any sort saying that we need to address this and we need to address this in the school systems?
Yes, there are multiple organizations campaigning for early intervention in these prevention courses. Like we had just talked about earlier, when it comes to encouraging free agency in young children, the earlier you start, the better. And we're seeing a lot of exercises with pre-K children in choice. Now, these choice exercises, they start simple with, do you want to play with this toy or that toy? Do you want to exercise like this or like that? And what we're finding is that this opportunity to choose encourages these students to develop a more firm sense of self at a very young age. And a firm sense of self lends a wealth of, and a stronger sense of self allows for greater strength in the face of adversity, especially in situations involving peer pressure or coercion.
And it seems like that's an example of how we succeed when we get it right, when we start to have these conversations. So what would that look like in the high school system of getting it right and being successful in teaching these types of consents?
Well, we at PASS actually collaborated with a company called Human.Plus, and we surveyed about 895,000 Americans. So that was currently enrolled students, their parents, and their school administrators. In this study, we found that 94% of all students want further education in consent. And even beyond that, we dug a little bit deeper and found out why. They're just confused. And it's a level of confusion on topics that are so important, like yes means yes, no means no. However, not all yeses are yeses. And how do we navigate around nonverbal cues like body language? Now, we're told not to interpret body language or nonverbal cues as a means of affirming consent. However, it is incredibly important to take in those nonverbal cues to identify when your partner is uncomfortable. So it's not really tit for tat here. Yes can mean yes, yes can mean no, no can never mean yes, and no always means no. So a lot of students need further clarity on how I can identify when my partner is uncomfortable, what can I do to communicate with them if they're uncomfortable. And there's a certain level of fear between students and their partners. They've seen the consequences. They've been taught this ambiguous idea of consent, and they don't really understand what the boundaries are. We're looking at close to 90% of all sexual encounters in college involving substances like alcohol or drugs to some degree. And in many cases, consumption of alcohol invalidates consent. Now, depending on your jurisdiction, like I know the state of New York has certain thresholds for intoxication, meaning you can share a glass of wine with your partner, and if you're both of sound mind and body, you can give and receive consent. But the question for a lot of these students is, what's that limit? What's that threshold? When does it become unsafe?
And especially if you are not of legal drinking age and you are in a situation,
Yes.
I would assume that would invalidate consent completely.
And beyond that, it's so funny you bring up the underage element there, because it plays a very powerful force in suppressing the reporting of sexual assaults and rapes. A lot of victims have fears that if they were drinking and they're underage, should they report, they may face consequences, legal consequences, for their acts, rather than find justice for the crime that was committed against them. And that plays into a whole slew of issues that impact reporting. So there's fear of retribution from their peers, from administrators. I'm no stranger to seeing these kinds of events happen myself. And I can say it's very real. Those fears are not unfounded. So the underage element is so perilous when it comes to alcohol and substances, but also think about the inexperience of these children. Anytime I got called to the principal's office, I was shaking in my boots, even if I did nothing wrong. So in a vulnerable state, I can't imagine a situation in which a student would feel comfortable coming forward to try to find justice when they have these burdens weighing them down.
I think something important that you just pointed out, maybe inadvertently, is you use the word children, which they are children. Anyone who is under the age of 18 who is engaging in sexual activity, they are a child. But to that point, just because you have turned 18 and you're at college away from home for the first time, that does not make you a world-wearied adult either. And so I think that there's some issues there. What happens as soon as children basically go to college and suddenly they're on their own for the first time?
It's really jarring to try to wrap my head around this notion that you can be a 17-year-old in high school one day, still a child, and then the second you turn 18 and get shipped off to college, there's this expectation of independence and this expectation to handle yourself, your wellness, your well-being, and your safety all on your own. And, you've got students coming from all over the place, outside of the state, outside of the country, which can be just a terrifying prospect, not only for the children, but for their parents as well. Within our study, we had found that one of the larger concerns of parents was that they didn't feel their students understood formal consent. And what I mean by that is a lot of parents had fears that their student wouldn't understand how to properly give or receive consent, and that they would get themselves into trouble. It's a really interesting notion that a child is suddenly an adult just by difference of a few days, few weeks, few months. And as you know, and pretty much everyone else in the world knows at this point, women and men mature at different rates.
Yes, we do.
Women experience mental maturity much faster than men do. It takes men until about 23, and in some cases, like me, maybe 27, to really fully develop. But the biggest issue is that the part of the brain that matures the latest in life is the part that deals with consequences. And we're sending these immature, underdeveloped individuals to a situation in which there's a plethora of alcohol, parties, and opportunities for high-risk situations to come about. So you mix all of that together with a base level of unpreparedness, and you have a perfect storm for sexual assault.
Speaking of that perfect storm, we've talked about this, and there's a term which you will introduce the audience to. There is a particularly vulnerable time during the first 1 to 2 years on campus. Am I correct? So will you talk a little bit about that and why that is such an important time for being aware of consent and, like you said, developing that sense of what consequences might come?
Yes, absolutely. Well, MIT had kind of coined the term red zone.
Okay.
Now, this red zone refers to the first 4 semesters of college, so freshman and sophomore year, basically. And that is where 80% of all sexual assaults on college campuses occurs. Those first 4 semesters. And while we're on the subject of numbers here, 1 in 6 women, this is a very hard stat, 1 in 6 women will be sexually assaulted before they graduate from their undergraduate program. And it's 1 in 15 for men. Take all of these numbers with a grain of salt. They've been taken from what I believe to be one of the ultimate authorities on these kinds of statistics, which is RAINN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. An amazing resource for sexual assault prevention and awareness. We have very skewed statistics on men because their likelihood of reporting a molestation or sexual assault is about 7%. So we don't have all the data, and we can't even begin to understand just how bad the issue truly is for both young men and women. Sexual assault is the most underreported crime worldwide.
Why is that? I mean, we talked a little bit about the repercussions, but how do we encourage people to speak out?
I think, and a lot of experts think, that it has a lot to do with the reporting pipeline. So the ease in which an individual can report the crime and how casual the entire situation is has a dramatic effect on incoming reports. For instance, one study had shown that the more steps it took for a victim to report their sexual assault formally, the less likely they were to undergo the process. And in a similar vein, campuses in which there are peer counseling services available, very informal, very casual, disarming environment in which someone can talk to their peer about an injurious experience, allows them to kind of talk through it without the fear that they will be forced to report. Because I'm not sure if you would know this, but the Sandusky law, after the incident with Jerry Sandusky on Penn State's campus, there had been a new law requiring any faculty member of a campus, a college campus or university, once they're made aware of a sexual assault, they are required by law to report it to the police. Now, that strikes a bit of fear into the hearts of victims who aren't ready to report yet. You know, these things, they take time, and everyone is ready at their own pace. Now, the fear of being forced to report, to have that autonomy taken away from you, after you've already been taken advantage of to such an egregious extent, it's terrifying. So, peer counseling centers are a wonderful resource for students to start that process and get more comfortable sharing their story before they move forward with a formal report. Now, I firmly believe in the effectiveness of peer counseling centers. I've taken advantage of them myself. A lot of my friends who had experienced some kind of sexual violence, they themselves have really expressed a great level of gratitude for their opportunity to talk to their peers.
I think that's incredible, and I hope that we see those centers pop up more, because we do need this sense of community. Because when someone has undergone a sexual assault and experienced sexual violence, they're feeling very isolated and scared and alone. And so I love that there's a place where they can go and speak to someone who maybe had a similar experience and find a sense of safety.
Absolutely. And I think that peer counseling centers are really catching on. A university in which we had visited in New York, the University of Mount St. Vincent, they were a wonderful partner for our exploratory study on the effectiveness of currently existing preventative education programs. Now, they had a peer counseling center, they do weekly outreach, as well as tabling, so they have student volunteers tabling to give people information on sexual wellness. And I really think that, like you said, getting the whole community involved plays a major role in increasing the visibility on the issue, as well as preventing anyone from kind of hiding away from the public eye and committing these atrocious acts.
This has been an incredibly enlightening conversation, talking about high schools, talking about colleges, but I'm really interested, what is PASS doing to provide education beyond just the very meager sex ed that students are currently getting in high school?
Thank you for asking. We at PASS have taken a lot of time to dedicate background research, market research, and further research on our own curriculum. And we've developed what we believe to be the most effective means of communicating these themes, like coercion, affirmative consent, recognizing nonverbal cues of reticence or hesitance, and an effective program in instructing young men and women on how to avoid the dangers of alcohol involved with sexual encounters. When it comes to educating students on consent, we had held a program with a New Jersey high school, and we found that the most effective way to communicate these themes is through scenario-based training. Now, it's nothing too novel, but the way we handle it is a bit different. Rather than your standard, half a page long reading assignment or static photo with a narration, we provide custom tailored videos for each specific theme. And we really walk the students through each danger or each potential danger within the situation that's displayed in the video. And we found that in themes concerning coercion and alcohol, that the comprehension rate went from 0% up 100% in those two specific areas, as well as a 17% increase in general comprehension overall. So the effectiveness of our program has been proven not only there, but as well as 2 other schools in which we've held our program.
This is absolutely incredible. So PASS is not just on the cutting edge of education, but really you have created a culture of consent for students who never have maybe even thought about it. So that really is a triumph, and the organization's only been around for a very short time, so to see that level of success already shows that this is an area that needs to be addressed.
Well, I really appreciate that, Ashley. And the really fun part of educating on consent is that with these younger generations, I recognized that they've grown accustomed to short form media, TikTok, Instagram Reels. I myself have gone down a endless scrolling loop before, but that really helped us tailor our program into short, quick bursts of learning that are easy to digest. We made sure that the wording, the verbiage is kind of easily comprehended by anyone at any reading level. So there's no need to overcomplicate these themes, despite how ambiguous and complicated everything already is. We made it kind of cartoonish, kind of fun, and then in the more serious, more dark themes, we really rein it in. We've been able to draw upon popular culture references, and specifically with the New Jersey students, they all watched Euphoria. So they were intimately aware of themes of coercion concerning power imbalances, student-teacher relations, workplace interactions between maybe your direct superior or even CEO, and they were acutely aware of these themes of power imbalances because of Euphoria. And I have to say that was one of the first examples of popular media influencing consent understanding in a really positive way.
That's fantastic. I hope that we continue to see that and that these open conversations continue because our students need it. And I'm thankful that organizations like PASS exist to be leaders in education, and that the work that you're doing not only has changed high schools and colleges, but will lead to hopefully some incredible lobbying and changes as we move forward and look at the administration and government work that we do. So thank you, Alex, so much for coming. I'm so incredibly thrilled to continue our conversation and look forward to talking more about this.
Likewise, Ashley, and thank you for your kind words.
Thank you.